Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to talk about kind of our fledgling nation, our first government, the Articles of Confederation, passed right at the tail end of the American Revolution, and only active for a relatively short period of time before we realize they're kind of broken, and we're going to need to create the American Constitution. So let's talk about this. So you have the Articles of Confederation. Now there's some problems with the Articles. First, there's no executive, so no president, no central leader. It's just one Congress, every state gets one vote, and getting everyone to vote together is very, very hard. There's no federal courts to really speak of. You kind of have a Supreme Court kind of thing, but not really, so the courts are mainly at the state levels. The Articles doesn't have the power to tax. Basically, the Articles is a charity. It relies on the donations of the states. And most states, right after the revolution, are like, we don't have any money to spare, so no one really wants to pay any taxation or any kind of donation to the federal government. So they can't really regulate trade, and trade's kind of getting out of hand. So each state is going to create their own tax and tariff and trade system to basically, if you wanted to go from like sell or take goods from New York and cross all the states down to Georgia, each time you cross into a new state, you're going to have to pay a new tax. And that's going to make goods very, very expensive. So not going great. And it was very difficult to pass amendments on the Articles because the Articles needed a unanimous vote to get an amendment passed. So today we need somewhere between 3/4 to 2/3, and it takes a vote, but once a certain number is hit, it becomes an amendment. At this point in time, 100% of all states had to agree. Now, that doesn't happen at all today. It certainly didn't happen even at this point in time with only 13. So let's keep going. The Articles did pass one really, really good law. And it's so good that once the Constitution is made, they pass it again right away. It's called the Northwest Ordinance. And this designs the process for adding new states to the United States. Now, primarily it's focused on organizing what's called the Northwest Territory, that kind of yellow gold area on the map. So it's going to set the process in which we take a territory, a piece of land that we own, chop it up, and establish a process for going from, wild lands to an actual state. So you can kind of see how they cut stuff up in the Northwest Territory in green. And they used this grid system to kind of break up land. And it's going to be the same grid system we use across the whole United States at this point, or from this point on. So the process for statehood, all the different steps. So you have an unorganized territory. So it's just a wild piece of land. You have Native Americans, you have early settlers. No one really controls anything. No one really has rules or anything. But the federal government does send a governor out there, someone the federal government appoints to kind of make sure nothing's going too bad and to begin organizing the state as best they can, or the territory as best they can. Once it becomes an organized territory, once it hits 5,000 people, they can apply to become an organized territory. So it still has a federal government, but they can begin passing kind of a preliminary government, start ruling in certain ways, making some early decisions on the process to statehood. Once they hit 60,000 people, they can write a constitution, send that constitution to Congress, and apply for statehood. Now the big question is, are these new states going to be equal to the original 13, or are the original 13 going to be special and have special privileges? So you got to think about it from the viewpoint of the American Revolution. The 13 colonies broke from England and created the United States because they weren't treated equally. So whenever we're talking about our new territories, we're going to say full equality. Every new state is fully equal to the original 13. Now, a side note, slavery in the Northwest Territory is abolished. This is the first time Congress regulates slavery in a territory. This is going to be important. We'll see this later on where people contest that Congress doesn't have this right. Yet very early on, they exercise this right, and no one batted an eye when they did it, because most slave owners thought slavery didn't make sense up in this territory. But as we get closer to the Civil War, whether or not slavery can exist somewhere becomes irrelevant. They just want to spread slavery on principle. So you can kind of see the frontier areas you see as we're moving westward. Now, we don't quite have Louisiana territory yet. That's going to come in a few years. But all of this is slowly getting settled. So we're a very big nation very early on during this time period. Now, we have to understand we are an agrarian society. We are based on farming. 90% of everybody has a farm, produces most of their own food, does this kind of stuff. You have a few large towns, and that's about it. But almost everybody, almost 100%, 95, 90% of the population is doing farming of some sort. We are an agrarian nation. Now, the articles clearly aren't working. We're having a lot of problems that we've stated. So they create what's called the Annapolis Convention, put on, initially proposed by Alexander Hamilton. We don't get enough people. Only a handful of states and representatives. So they say, okay, this didn't work. We're going to try again next year. So they set the next year's convention to be in Philadelphia. So Alexander Hamilton and James Madison kind of came up with the Annapolis Convention. But something's going to happen between these two conventions that's going to get a lot more people at the second one. And that's called Shays Rebellion. This is when a group of farmers revolted against the federal government because they didn't want to pay taxes, and the banks were repossessing some of their lands because they couldn't pay debts after the American Revolution. This was happening in western Massachusetts, and the problem bubbled up because when Massachusetts went to the Articles government for help, the article said, well, we can't tax, therefore we don't have money, therefore we can't hire and raise an army. So it was just up to Massachusetts to put down their own rebellion. Now, eventually they get it put down. It's tenuous, but they get it put down. But the big problem is what's illustrated to the federal government in many of the states is if things go bad in our state, the federal government can't help us. So we might need to change the federal government in a big way. So this big argument was how much freedom should the government have? And if we have too much freedom, does that lead to anarchy? So many of the founders had this concept of a tyranny of the masses, this mob mentality. If too many poor, uneducated people got together, they were going to make bad decisions, kind of like Shays Rebellion. So we need a form of government that can kind of serve as a filter to filter out these bad decisions and only leave the good ones. So we get the Philadelphia Convention. Now, this was designed to only make amendments to fix the Articles. But very quickly, all the delegates from all the states realized, yeah, the Articles are so broken, we can't fix them. So they decide in secret. They shut all the windows, close all the doors. They decide in secret, we're going to write a new government. Now keep in mind, all these people were the same founding fathers that just fought a revolution to kick England out and create the Articles. Now they are secretly, without permission from the Articles government, writing a new government. Basically, they're creating a political coup. So, as you can see in the picture, they appoint George Washington as the head of the convention. Everybody in America loves George Washington. So, by putting him as the head, he is going to be kind of adding legitimacy to the convention. Now, the whole main argument of this convention was how do we balance the power of the federal government with the liberty of the people? Give the government enough power to effectively rule, but not so much power as to encroach upon individual liberties. So this toys with the idea of federalism. And this is what we're going to come up with as a result of the Philadelphia Convention. As you can kind of see, these two circles are equal. And this was the argument at the time. We can create a governmental system where the federal government and the state government are equal. They have equal power. No one is greater than the other. Now, this doesn't work. Basically, the people are going to have to obey two separate masters equally, and that never goes well. So this is going to change over time. Eventually, the federal government will exert more power, and the state governments will be beneath that. but they argue this so that the states feel like they're not losing too much power. And so we come up with this phrase, a sovereign union of sovereign states. So sovereign means a right to rule. So a sovereign has the right to rule a nation. So basically you're saying we're creating a sovereign government, a federal government that has absolute power, but the states have absolute power as well. Now, two people having absolute power is going to cause problems, and it will. But it's going to take us a few years to kind of figure the system out. Now, the main compromise, the main kind of system that we get to set up our government is going to be known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. So you have the New Jersey plan, which is a small state plan, and the Virginia plan, which is the big state plan. So we have a kind of better breakdown. So it's the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, and what it boils down to is what's known as a bicameral legislature. So two houses in Congress. So you have the lower house, which is the House of Representatives. So it's directly elected by the people, and it's based on population. So the bigger states have more power in the House of Representatives. So you have places like Texas today has more representatives in the House than, say, New Jersey. However, to balance that out, you have the Senate, the upper house, which everybody gets equal representation. So everybody has 2 senators. So even the big states might win in the House. The small states can balance it out in the Senate. So it's trying to create a balance of power between the large and small states. Then you get slavery. Now, slavery is a funny thing in the Constitution. Slavery is kind of a sticky point. A lot of the founding fathers saw the contradiction of slavery. A lot of them didn't like slavery, but a lot of them saw slavery as a necessary evil. Most of our founding fathers were slave owners. Some, like Washington, set their slaves free in their will. So basically Washington said, when my wife and I die, all our slaves will go free. Now, he won't do it during his own life because that would hurt his way of life. But he does do it later on. Once he dies, he and his wife die. But slavery is kind of this weird issue. So they find some wiggle ways around it. They don't ever use the word slave or slavery. They do things like persons held in bondage. So kind of basically saying slave without saying the word slavery. They come up with this thing called the 3/5 Compromise. Southerners wanted their slaves to count towards their population. Even though slaves couldn't vote, they wanted it to count towards population so that Southerners would have more votes in Congress. Northerners like, that's crappy. If the people can't vote, they shouldn't be counted towards population. So they come up with a compromise. For every 5 slaves, Southern states get 3 votes. But for those 3 votes, the Southern states have to pay additional taxes on those slaves as property. So basically the Southerners are trading financial gain for more votes. So lose a little money in order to get more votes. They postponed discussing the slave trade for 12 years, basically kick the can down the road for a little over a decade. And then finally, they have the Fugitive Slave Clause, which basically says the federal government will use U.S. Marshals to help hunt down runaway slaves. Now keep in mind, there's like 12 or so U.S. Marshals at this point in time. Not a lot, so really the government helping is going to be pretty weak. It's kind of a weak promise. It's more token gesture than anything. But the fact is all of these are there in some capacity arguing these points. So the government's broken up into 3 branches. The legislative branch, Congress, which makes the laws. The executive branch, the president, which enforces the laws. And the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, which interprets the law. So you can kind of see here, this is where we get checks and balances. So the executive, the president, can veto laws if he doesn't like them from Congress. But if Congress still thinks the laws are valid, they can override the veto. And if a law does get passed that seems to be shady, the Supreme Court can review that and say, nope, this law is not good. Now, the lawyers, the Chief Justice and all the different justices of the Supreme Court are proposed by the president, so he gets to pick those. But Congress has to approve their appointment. So everyone gets to check each other. So no one should have too much power. Now, who gets to interpret the Constitution? No one really knows right off the bat because it doesn't say in the document. Over time, the Supreme Court gains that power. We'll talk about several cases, and you'll read about them in your books. Several cases where the Supreme Court seizes that power slowly over time. Now, how do we get this passed? Well, we have what are called special conventions. Then we go, each individual state chooses a group of people to meet, vote yes or no to this new constitution. And they kind of target the big states, New York, Virginia first, because they feel if we hit the big states and those big states vote yes, the smaller states will feel like they're forced to kind of vote with the big states, and they'll be more likely to support the Constitution. Now, there's two groups of people fighting over whether or not to have the Constitution. The Federalists, which are pro-Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, which are opposed to the Constitution. Now, the Federalists are the ones that wrote it. The Anti-Federalists, they don't really like the Articles of Government. They don't like the Constitution that the Federalists are proposing, but they don't really have a third argument. So it's kind of a very weak stance. They're just kind of mad at everything and nothing's really on their side. So the Federalists are going to find ways around it. The first is they write a series of letters and pamphlets called the Federalist Papers. These are essays, different things that Alexander Hamilton, James May, and John Jay write to argue in favor of the Constitution. The big piece that really persuades the Anti-Federalists to get on board is the Bill of Rights, basically saying we will protect individual liberties if you add or if you support the Constitution. So the Constitution gets passed, and basically George Washington is forced to be the first president. He says, on the way to being inaugurated in New York, he says, "I feel as though I am a man going to the gallows." So he's not stoked about it, but nonetheless, he feels it is his civic duty as kind of one of the primary leaders of the nation to get the nation off to a good start. And a lot of things he does during his first 8 years as president are going to define what every other president does afterwards. You got to remember, whatever Washington did, everybody looked up to him in those regards. Now, the first capital was not in Washington, D.C. That hadn't been decided yet. Instead, it was going to be in New York. We'll talk about where we get Washington, D.C. and that kind of trade a little bit later in a later video. So Washington gets started, and a whole lot of different things are going to happen. And we'll read about those in our book, and we'll talk a little bit about those in later videos. But we'll stop there for today. Y'all have a great day.